I've added 3 new puzzles to the next level of my escape room horror game. In this video, I'll give you an in-depth view on my personal 3-step process I followed to develop them, as well as talk about some of the hurdles I've overcome. I'm making an escape room horror game which is releasing this Halloween. You can wishlist it on Steam. Right now, I'm nearly done with the 2nd level. I can't wait to show you what I've made. In my last video, I talked about how I designed this latest level. I've already developed 3 of the puzzles, and the process I followed can be divided into 3 parts. That being the look of the puzzle, how the player will interact with the puzzle, and finally, how it gets programmed. But before we take a look at this process, let me first show you the 3 puzzles I've made in the past 2 weeks. Firstly, we've got the sliding puzzle. You have to get this green block to the exit by moving the other blocks out of the way. Secondly, we got the graph puzzle, where you have to move the colored balls to the correct spots. And lastly, we have the memory puzzle, which is just a basic memory game. Right, now that you know the puzzles I've made, let's take a closer look at the first step of the process. So, I knew what 3 types of puzzles I wanted to have in the level, but I didn't know what these 3 puzzles would actually look like. For example, with the shape sliding puzzle, would the grid be 4x4, 6x6, or 10x10? And what shapes would these pieces be? These things are all very tied to the actual design goals. For example, a bigger grid would result in a longer and possibly more difficult puzzle. For the graph puzzle, having a different shape could add noise to the puzzle, making it more difficult. And for the memory game, having more pairs and more complicated symbols would make it more difficult. When I had put the graph puzzle in the game, the colors were initially very hard to distinguish from each other, which was not a problem I had initially thought about, and only really stood out to me when I tried the puzzle myself. To get around this issue, I used this website called Visually Distinct Colors Generator, where you can specify how many colors you want and then it generates them for you. When I used these colors instead of the old ones, they were a lot easier to distinguish from each other, resulting in a less frustrating and confusing puzzle. The next thing I thought about was style. It depends on the rest of the game. For WonSocket, I like the low poly style, both because it is easy to make and because I don't have much experience working with 3D modeling. Also, the models get pixelated anyway, so there's no need to waste time on small details. For my personal style, I like to make things diegetic, basically everything that the player in-game sees. So no UI elements. I ask myself, how would this work if it was in the real world? And go from there. This makes it both easy to get ideas and program. Alright, next up is the interaction. My main focus with interaction is on minimizing the frustration the puzzle causes to the player. Let's simplify things and say that frustration depends on the following elements: input, output, and difficulty. In this case, the input concerns how the player interacts with the puzzle, whilst the output is the information that the puzzle shows to the player. Let's first talk about input. We ask ourselves, how will the player interact with the puzzle? For example, when we want to move a square, do they just click on one of the squares and then arrows pop up on the screen which decide where it moves? Do you just have them click and drag the square, or just click and it moves on its own? These are all valid options, but which one did I choose? Well, it depends on the puzzle. For the graph puzzle, I could not just have a click interaction because I had 2 empty slots. If an element would move directly after clicking on it once, it could go to either empty option. If the player wanted it to go to a specific one and it went to the other, it would cause frustration, especially in tense situations. So instead, I let the player click on the element and then drag it in the direction they want it to go. Next, we have the output. I want to clearly communicate to the player how far into the puzzle they are, or if they're doing it correctly. For example, in the Simon Says puzzle in level 1, I made it display the amount of rounds they had completed, and how many total rounds they are. Going back to the colors in the graph puzzle, I'm still wondering if these colors are clear enough. And I'm wondering if I should add an additional visual elements that shows if the ball is really in the right position, to make it extra clear which ones are correct and which ones are not. I'm considering making the nodes light up when the ball is in the correct position. Let me know what you guys think. Lastly, we have difficulty. For puzzles in WonSocket, I don't want them to be too difficult, as difficult puzzles can become frustrating quickly if the player does not know how to solve them. I had to keep in mind that WonSocket is not just about solving puzzles. Players have to hear and look out for a terrifying monster, charge a generator to keep the light and other devices powered, and more. They are doing a lot of things at once, meaning I can't expect the player to solve very difficult puzzles as well. In real-life escape rooms, players typically have access to hints. Game designers can intentionally make the puzzles more challenging, and players who have a more difficult time can use these hints to get extra help. But this seems very difficult to implement for my game, and I'd rather design the puzzles in a way where the player would not need any hints. Testing is a very good way to know if the interactions are understandable and if the difficulty is right. I let my mom test out the puzzles. She almost never plays games, and she managed to complete them all without any problems, which was really good. We've now come to the final part of the process. You've designed the puzzle, you've thought about how the players will interact with the puzzle, and how the puzzle will communicate back to the player. Now you just need to program all this functionality in code. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, the way I approach programming is I try to find a solution that will require me to do the least amount of programming, but still give me valuable and desirable results. For example, you might think that the sliding puzzle needs a complicated grid system to work, where each of the shapes occupy tiles on the grid, and then check if a shape can be moved depending on this grid. But no, there is no grid system. There is not even a manager that works out where certain blocks can move. Instead, how it works is that each tile has their own separate class that tells if it can move or not. It works kind of like sonar or echolocation. Each block can cast a ray from its sides. If any of these rays hit another object, the distance from the block to the object can be calculated. If the distance is too short, the block will know that the path is not clear and it cannot move to that direction. If there is enough space between the blocks and the object, the player will be able to move it. When a block moves, it moves only a certain distance at a time, giving the illusion that it is moving in a grid, while in reality, there is no grid snapping or anything complicated like that happening. One thing to keep in mind is that these three processes all have an effect on each other. For example, choosing a certain color affects both the look and interaction of the puzzle. Visually distinct colors might increase the interaction, but could decrease the look and aesthetics. Actually, this applies not just for these three. It could apply to each element of the game. It's quite interesting, actually, and Daniel Mullins talks about it in his recent talk about his Ludum Dare game jam. I've linked the talk in the description. That's the process I followed when creating the puzzles. Right now I'm working on the events. They will basically be small tasks that the player will have to do quickly at the same time as solving the puzzles to avoid making the monster angry. Anyway, if you would like to contribute and test this level when it's finished, join the Discord. I have loads more OneSocket related videos. I'd suggest you watch this one. Thank you for watching.